Welcome to the Clinical File. I'm John Cordray, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Jefferey McDonald case. I'll be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, it's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. Can a man lead a double life so convincingly that he even begins to believe his own fiction? What happens when a high-achieving, charismatic surgeon is pushed to a psychological breaking point by the very life he worked so hard to build? We're looking at a case that has spanned over 5 decades, involving the brutal 1970 murders of Colette McDonald and her 2 young daughters, Kimberly and Kristen. This analysis will peel back the layers of the perfect facade to see if we can find the cracks that led to such a catastrophic explosion of violence. The evidence that we'll examine suggests a possible intersection of narcissistic traits, extreme stress, and a desperate need for control. But first, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible for a person to commit an unspeakable act and then immediately create a new reality to protect their ego? Was this a premeditated act of a cold-blooded individual or a momentary overload of a fragile psyche that could no longer maintain its composure? And perhaps most importantly, how does a person convince the world and possibly themselves of their innocence for 56 years? On the morning of February 17, 1970, military police at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, responded to a 3:42 a.m. emergency call from Captain Jeffery McDonald. When they arrived, they found a scene that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. McDonald was found lying across his wife, Colette, in the master bedroom. She had been beaten and stabbed repeatedly. Their 5-year-old daughter, Kimberly, and 2-year-old daughter, Kristen, were also found dead. They were all victims of a horrific multi-weapon attack. McDonald himself had suffered several wounds, including a life-threatening collapsed lung, though many of his other injuries were described by medical staff as superficial. From a psychological perspective, the why often begins with how the story is told immediately following the trauma. McDonald told investigators that he had been sleeping on the couch when he was awakened by the screams of his wife and eldest daughter. He claimed he was attacked by 4 intruders, 3 men and a blonde woman wearing a floppy hat and carrying a candle, chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." This narrative is the first red flag we need to examine, the immediate displacement of guilt. In many cases of domestic homicide involving high-status individual, there is an immediate attempt to externalize the threat. By invoking the imagery of a drug-crazed hippies, McDonald was tapping into the specific cultural fears of 1970, just months after the Manson family murders. Psychologically, this is known as socially convenient narrative, where the perpetrator chooses a villain that society is already primed to fear. As a counselor, I look at the discrepancy between the physical evidence and the verbal report as a sign of cognitive dissonance. The living room where McDonald claimed to have fought for his life was remarkably tidy, with only a coffee table overturned and a single lamp knocked down. Yet the bedrooms where the family lay were scenes of absolute carnage. If 4 people were attacking an athletic Green Beret officer, why was there little evidence of a struggle in the area where he claimed it occurred? This brings us to the second red flag, the need for heroic victimhood. McDonald didn't just say he was a victim. He framed himself as a warrior who fought to the end, even claiming his pajama top was used to ward off stabs. However, forensic analysis showed that the holes in his pajama top were smooth and cylindrical, as if they were made while the fabric was stationary. And the blood on the pajama top was found to be his wife's blood, deposited before the garment was torn. This suggests a meticulous attempt to craft a story that preserved his image as a protector, even in the face of total failure. Jeffery McDonald was the quintessential golden boy of his time. He was a Princeton graduate, a medical doctor, and a captain in the Green Berets. His life, on paper, was a series of uninterrupted successes, which often fosters a sense of power in the personality. When a person with an extremely high need for external validation faces internal stressors, the mask can become heavy. At the time of the murders, McDonald was working long hours as a surgeon, helping care for 2 young children and his wife, who was pregnant with their 3rd child. Reports also indicated that McDonald may have been taking a diet pill containing amphetamines to keep up with his demanding schedule. This leads to our 3rd psychological indicator, the chemical compromise of impulse control. Amphetamines can increase irritability, paranoia, and rage reactions in individuals who are already predisposed to high levels of stress. If there was a domestic dispute that night, perhaps over something as mundane as a child wetting the bed, a chemically fueled mind might react with overkill. In psychological terms, overkill is often a sign of a personal relationship between the killer and the victim, as it represents a release of deep-seated suppressed anger. The brutality of the scene, ice-pick wounds, knife stabs, and clubbing, suggests an explosion of affect that is rarely seen in random intruder attacks. The 4th psychological red flag is the lack of congruent affect. After the murders, McDonald's behavior was noted by many as being detached or even inappropriately upbeat. He famously appeared on the Dick Cavett Show in 1970, where he joked and seemed more concerned about his reputation than the loss of his family. While everyone grieves differently, as a licensed professional counselor, I look for affect blunting or narcissistic preoccupation. If his primary concern was how the public perceived him as a hero, it suggests that his ego was the primary survival that night. His stepfather-in-law, Freddie, initially supported him, but became his fiercest hunter after reading the investigative transcripts. His father-in-law noticed that McDonald's stories began to shift and grow more elaborate over time. In psychology, we call this pseudo fantastica, where a person tells complex lies to restore their own self-esteem or status. The military initially cleared McDonald in 1970 during an Article 32 hearing, citing a botched investigation and evidence of intruders. This would be a chance to grieve in peace, but McDonald's need for the spotlight continued. He moved to California, lived a flamboyant life as a bachelor, and invited author Joe McGinnis to write a book about his wrongful ordeal. This move backfired spectacularly when McGinnis, after spending years with McDonald, became convinced of his guilt. The book Fatal Vision portrayed McDonald as a pathological narcissist who was definitely capable of the murders. This brings us to the 5th indicator, the arrogance of the infallibility. McDonald believed he was smarter than the investigators, the lawyers, and even the man he hired to tell his story. He gave McGinnis full access, never suspecting that the professional observer might see through the facade. In 1979, 9 years after the crime, the Justice Department finally brought the case to trial. The prosecution's theory was that an argument over the bedwetting incident by the youngest daughter, Kristen, triggered a violent outburst. They argued that McDonald killed Colette first, then the children to eliminate witnesses, and then staged the scene. The 6th psychological red flag is staging as a defense mechanism. Staging a crime scene is a sophisticated psychological act. It requires the killer to step outside their own emotions and view the scene through the eyes of the police. The word pig written in blood on the headboard was a direct imitation of the Tate murders. However, investigators found that the blood used to write the word was Colette's, and it was applied while wearing a surgical glove. Fragments of a surgical glove were found under the headboard, and they matched the gloves McDonald kept in his kitchen. This cognitive complexity during a moment of supposed trauma suggests a person who is highly controlled and focused on self-preservation. The defense, meanwhile, focused on Helena Stockley, a local trouble woman who fit the description of the blonde in a floppy hat. made several conflicting confessions over the years, claiming she was there but couldn't remember the details. However, she was known to have significant mental health issues and heavy drug addiction, making her a malleable witness. Psychologically, people can sometimes internalize famous crimes because of the need for identity or a blurred reality from substance use. The court ultimately found her testimony unreliable because she could never provide facts that weren't already public knowledge. In 1979, a jury convicted Jeffery McDonald on 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, but for McDonald, the battle was just beginning, leading to decades of appeals and new forensic technology. The 7th red flag is the chronic maintenance of a false self. For over 50 years, McDonald has never wavered, never expressed a moment of guilt-ridden reflection, and never changed his core narrative. In the world of mental health, this can be seen as delusional systemization. If a person's ego cannot survive the truth of what they have done, the mind may create a watertight alternate reality. To McDonald, he was not a murderer. He was the persecuted hero, a victim of a government conspiracy. This belief system is so robust that it has convinced many supporters, including members of the Innocent Project at various points. However, as DNA technology evolved in the 1990s and 2000s, the intruder theory began to crumble. Tests on a hair found on Colette's hand, which McDonald claimed belonged to one of the killers, showed it was actually his own hair. While some unidentified hairs were found at the scene, forensic experts noted that in a household with a frequent guest, this is not uncommon. The physical evidence, the silent witness, repeatedly pointed back to the man inside the house. Our 8th and final red flag is the lack of empathy for the victims in the narrative. When you listen to McDonald's interviews, notice how much of the story is about his injuries, his career, and his legal battle. The lives of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen often seem like props in his larger drama of personal injustice. In a healthy grieving process, the focus remains on the lost loved ones. In a narcissistic process, the focus remains on the loss the survivor has endured. New information from 2021 and 2024 shows that McDonald's legal avenues have almost entirely closed. In September 2021, he dropped his appeal for a compassionate release, acknowledging that he had no further legal standing to challenge his conviction. As of early 2026, Jeffery McDonald remains in federal prison, now in his 80s, still maintaining the same story he told in 1970. From a clinical perspective, we have to look at the why as the perfect storm of personality and pressure. A man who had always been the best could not handle the moment of being the worst. Rather than face the reality of a domestic tragedy sparked by rage, he chose to live a 50-year lie. The tragedy of the McDonald case is not just the murders themselves, but the psychological vacuum that followed. 3 lives were extinguished, and a 4th was spent in prison of its own making. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous masks are the ones that are never taken off. When we look at this case over 50 years ago, we kind of break down the different evidence and the reports and just the court findings that came out and the forensic evidence that came out over time, it really seems like it's a domestic rage that happened. Probably a lot of resentment building up and building up and building up, and the stress and the pressure of his career. He likely snapped. I don't think this was, or at least it doesn't seem like it was premeditated. He didn't plan it for years and years. It seems like in this case, he did snap, and he turned into a narcissistic rage and killed his wife and unfortunately his kids because they were likely witnesses of it. It's such a tragedy that so many people have been affected. And Jeffery is still in prison. I'm sure he'll be there for the rest of his life. He's in his 80s now. And the fact that he's hanging on to the same narrative is pretty psychologically interesting to me. Either he's convinced himself that he's innocent, or he's still maintaining this facade that maybe in hopes that people will let him go. I don't know. But there's a lot of psychological layers to this case. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.